Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to how did the American Civil War actually happen, and this is a recent video posted by Knowledge Gia. I thought it was Knowledgepedia for a second. Knowledge Gia, and this is part 1. I don't know if there's a part 2, but as it's a new video and I saw it pop up, I thought I'd give it a watch or give it a reaction. And as always, go show this channel some support. If you haven't watched it before and you enjoy this reaction, subscribe or whatever. I'll do the same if I enjoy it. But yeah, we're going to check this out. I don't know how this channel is because, again, I've never checked it out, but I see it's done quite well, so I'm assuming it's a pretty informative video. And yeah, we're going to jump into this. Hopefully you're going to enjoy. Links are in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more reactions of mine. I'm going to be reacting to a Patreon video today, and I have been reacting to it a lot more often recently. For the last few months, I've posted a lot of different types of reactions. So yeah, if you want to see that, links are in the description for those interested. But let's jump into this and see the situation. See, I can see here there's different phases, the intro. I don't want to skip all over them, but you can sort of see the Mexican-American War, and I guess it touches into different parts of it. But yeah, let's jump into this.
1819. The newly born United States of America sat in a state of delicate balance. 11 free states, 11 slave states. From the outside looking in, it appeared to be perfect harmony. Equal states, equal representation, equal influence in federal affairs. But this was only from the outside looking in. In reality, there was no focus on balance for the Americans. Instead, all that mattered now was expansion. Manifest destiny. That was the reason why the United States government was hell-bent on snagging more and more territory. Although the phrase wouldn't be coined until the mid-1800s, the belief held by many Americans that it was the nation's destiny to expand westward as far as can be done drove the U.S. to do just that. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama. That was the whole of the United States thus far as of 1819. But only a year later, this would change. In 1818, the Missouri Territory, previously obtained as part of the Louisiana Purchase, began its push for statehood. The following year, the District of Maine would be allowed to break off from Massachusetts and do the same. It didn't take long for—
Wait, I just clocked. Massachusetts was like this. Oh, it was a little connection here. Damn, I didn't know that. What? That's such a weird way to have it.
Would be allowed to break off from Massachusetts and do the same. It didn't take long for this to cause a conundrum for the contemporary U.S., however, because the addition of 2 more states had the potential to upset the numerical balance between slave states and free states. On the one hand, Northerners and pro-abolitionists in Congress argued that the addition of Missouri, which seemed to quickly lean toward wanting to become a slave state, would expand slavery and thus bring them further away from their goals. The Southerners, though, were obviously in favor of adding another slave state, and thus argued that any new candidate for statehood should have the right to decide for themselves, just as the first 13 colonies which side on the fence they want to fall on. The debate in both the House of Representatives and the Senate would continue into 1819, at which point Maine was now brought into the mix, as Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House at the time, suggested that Missouri should be added to the Union as a slave state, but that Maine should also be added, contrarily, as a free state. This proposal was subsequently debated into yet another year, when in 1820, the Senate added to the bill, requiring that any other territories north of the 36° 30' latitude line that had been agreed upon below Missouri's lower border could only enter the Union as free states. With everyone finally in some level of agreement, the Missouri Compromise was signed into law. This triggered a tit-for-tat war of adding one new slave state for every new free state and vice versa, starting with Arkansas in 1836, Michigan the next year, and Florida in 1845. And since Florida was a slave state, it was assumed that the next territory to enter the Union and statehood would be another free state. But this became complicated when Texas had a demanding request for the United States: annex us now. The history of Texas has been a roller coaster thus far, and yet it was only now preparing for its biggest climb yet. Texas, up until recently a part of Mexico after being freed from the grip of the Spaniards, wanted to join a different union, the USA. The Texans' pleas were initially ignored by the US government, which wasn't in much favor of annexing the nearby territory, with growing pressure from Britain for Texas to be an independent nation and America's undeniable thirst for expansion.
Imagine Texas was its own country. That would have been so interesting. Like, how would... That would just be weird. It's just so weird to think about the US being the same, but just Texas was its own country. It would be so strange. I'm not saying it would be wrong or right, but it'd just be so weird to even picture. Like, I don't know. Like, how would it be now? Say the US never annexed Texas, but then Texas just somehow got independence from Mexico. How different do you think it would be? Do you still think culturally it would be the same as it is? Because it is kind of like a mixture of America and Mexico, like Mexican cultures. But do you think it would be the same, or do you reckon it would have went a whole different route? Like, I wonder, man, because they've got all the resources there and stuff, so I'm sure it would have prospered like it is now. But yeah, I wonder how it would have been.
Opinions would soon change nevertheless, and Texas would, in fact, join the Union on December 29th, 1845. Here was the issue, though. Texas wanted to be a slave state, which would offset the balance the Northerners had tried so hard to keep. Furthermore, Texas had made claims to territories that put it in direct conflict with its former host of Mexico. And with Texas newly a part of the United States, those presumptuous claims were now the responsibility of the US, something that Mexico didn't take lightly. Recently elected President James K. Polk, however, didn't care one bit what the Mexicans thought. Instead, he was an aggressive supporter of Manifest Destiny, and quickly upon his inauguration, hoped to seize the contested territories. Thus, Polk at first attempted to purchase his desired lands. He sent American diplomat John Slidell to offer the administration in Mexico City $30 million in exchange for California, New Mexico, and disputed territories along the Texas border. The Mexicans, aghast and unshakably against such an idea, declines to even meet Slidell, which angered Polk. The Manifest Destiny supporter would not be swayed by this rejection, and instead decided that, if diplomacy wouldn't work, he would reel his neighbors into a war he knew the United States would win. As a result, in the early weeks of 1846, the president sent American troops to the Texas border to egg the Mexicans on. And it worked. It only took a few months for Mexican soldiers to fire on the Americans and give Polk the excuse to declare war. With the Mexican-American War underway, debates continued within the United States pertaining to the slave state versus free state debacle. With the free states now outnumbered, the Northerners felt that Polk, being a Southerner himself, was actually committing his land grab in order to further bolster the slave state advantage, which boosted north-to-south tensions. Still, the war raged on, with now famed generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee showing their prowess and adding to their resumes, while the Americans inched closer to Mexico's capital. The city was eventually taken and warfare halted, leading to the long-awaited Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which now forced Mexico to cede not only the contested territories in California, Arizona, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, but also lands of modern-day Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Polk had gotten his way and more. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. New land meant more to fight over back home. Over the next few years, Iowa, Wisconsin, and California would all give their bids for statehood, eventually bringing about the Compromise of 1850. This series of bills would address a multitude of things, though mostly focused on the institution of slavery within the Union. In short, it determines that California would join the Union as a free state, but was required to send one pro-slavery senator to the Senate in order to maintain the readjusted balance.
What the hell? That's crazy how the political views were then. You had to have someone, a pro-slavery person. That is... Wow. Mad.
From now on, however, slave or free states from the remaining territories gained from Mexico would be decided as such by popular sovereignty. This went all right at first, as would the admission to statehood of Minnesota in 1858 and Oregon in 1859. But predictably, there was simultaneously another reason for tensions to rise. As part of the new establishment of popular sovereignty, Senator Stephen Douglas suggested applying the strategy to a proposed newly organized Nebraska territory that would at once repeal the Missouri Compromise slave state border and split the Nebraska territory in two. Now, despite a struggle to actually pass the new bill that would become known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the populations of both territories were left to vote on whether they wished to permit slavery or not. The consequence of this, and maybe unpredictably so, was that settlers began flooding to both Nebraska and Kansas, settlers from both sides of the slavery debate. This slippery slope ushered in a tragic era known as Bleeding Kansas, which would eventually see Kansas enter the Union in 1861, surprisingly, as a free state. This would be the final state admitted to the Union before the start of the Civil War. Why did things get to this point? How could such a young nation have fallen into battle with itself so fast? Why were the North and
It is kind of easy to see why there's so much political divide in the US. Like, every country has political divide, right? You see what's happening in Brazil, stuff happens in the UK, like, it happens everywhere. But from the get-go, the US has been going through these political debates and differences between the country from the start. And again, it happens in every country. You see it happening in lots of countries, but it just makes you realize probably why the tensions are so high in the US. Like, every video I do, when it's somewhat political, like this video will get some comments of like backing certain sides, but like every time I react to something like that, there's going to be comments of both sides just saying whatever, and I'm just there like, you know what, you say what you want, I'm just here to react, you know. But it's easy to see why that's the case, because you see from, I guess, the creation of the US, it's just been like, it's always been somewhat divided anyway. Maybe it's because of the UK, to be fair. Maybe we're the reason that it's so divided. Who knows? But yeah, it's crazy because the percentage of the population in these states, when the states were first created, I'm assuming a lot of it were from the UK or Ireland or like the Netherlands, like those European countries. So the fact that the beliefs were so different when that's where they all originally came from is kind of insane to me. But hey, that's how it ended up happening.
South so opposed to each other. The issue of slavery, and thus the North versus South contention, can be blamed on vastly different cultural aspects of the two halves of America. For the North, slavery was not really needed, as the upper state...
Oh, okay, because of the South, I guess the farming and stuff. This is where most of the farming happens in the US, right? Maybe not. Maybe I'm talking on my ass.
had quickly become industrialized and thus didn't have to rely on as much manpower. This gave Northern citizens the opportunity to unbiasedly consider the moral standing of the entire institution of slavery, prompting many to call it into question. Supported by the ideas of European immigrants who had come from nations that had already outlawed slavery, these Northerners began to turn toward abolitionism. This was in total opposition to their fellow Americans down south, of course, but this was because the South had failed to industrialize as the North had. Instead, Southerners were more economically dependent on free labor for plantations and the like, which meant that their personal finances and way of life could be entirely affected by the banning of slavery, thus making it hard for a Southerner to even give the moral aspect a second thought, though some did and still supported the institution. And with the invention of the cotton gin, the matter only became more solidified. The South needed slavery. The problem then arose as the North wondered if Southerners wanted to extend slavery even further, whereas the latter worried that the former was going to take the slaves they already had. Both, ironically, would be right. The North and South were miles away from reconciling this difference. Debatably, there was also the issue of federal versus state rights, although this factor is hard to blame entirely. Not only did the later formed Confederacy have a shockingly large bureaucratic system for a collection of states who were opposed to overbearing federal governments, but there had also been previous opportunities, such as during the nullification crisis a few decades prior, for the South to go to war with the North, or at least raise more of a ruckus if state rights were the core issue. Still, it is true that many people at the time, particularly in the South, had more loyalty to their state than country as a whole, and state versus federal disconnect likely played somewhat of a role in tensions, even if second fiddle to the slavery argument. The fanning of the flames, however, came from a string of amplifying events. The Fugitive Slave Act, for example, had been part of the Compromise of 1850 and galvanized abolitionists, as it had made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and penalizing escaped slaves and anyone who aided them, even if they made it to a free state. With the Northerners deeply troubled by this development, politically active citizens of the upper United States would soon form their own opposition party to the pro-slavery Democrats, the Republican Party. This new entity would also become host to the controversial Abraham Lincoln shortly after its birth.
Wait, let me just go back. The Republican Party, also known as the GOP Grand Old Party, was founded in 1854 by those who were against the expansion of slavery and afterwards in favour of slavery abolition. Okay, so was this the first party at this point in time then? Or what was the first party? Was there parties before this, or was it just presidents and stuff and it slowly turned into like different parties? But okay, the first party, or the Republican Party against slavery. Okay, I see.
To the controversial Abraham Lincoln shortly after its birth. Lincoln had previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 before joining the Republicans and running for Senate a decade later. Although he lost the Senate race to Stephen Douglas, the series of speeches and debates that preceded the election had both catapulted him to popularity in the North while earning him a fair share of enemies in the South. His mere existence as a political entity thus stirred the pot and increased tensions. But then, so did Bleeding Kansas. Guerrilla warfare is one way that this period from 1855 through 1859 has been described. While Nebraska was somewhat hit by the flood of both pro- and anti-slavery settlers hoping to sway the coming vote, it was Kansas that was truly beaten. Pro-slavery residents of neighboring states used legal loopholes to cross the border and vote in Kansas's territorial elections, setting off a domino effect that would lead to a split government and all-out violence. Historians estimate that anywhere from 50 to 200 Americans died as a consequence in the 4-year span, something akin to pouring a couple of gallons of gasoline on the growing fire burning towards civil war. Charles Sumner's congressional speech about Kansas would further heighten the situation. A Republican Northerner, Sumner had actually memorized every last word in his impassioned speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he lambasted the entire institution of slavery and even took direct jabs at pro-slavery senators. This instance serves as a clear example of the current level of tensions in the Union and Congress, as South Carolina Representatives Preston Brooks and Lawrence Keitt reacted to the damning speech by physically assaulting Charles Sumner with a cane, beating him so severely that he would need 3 full years of leave to recover. And this was only a year before one of the most controversial and anger-fueling incidents of the entire lead-up to the Civil War. It was the Dred Scott case that soon put the move toward all-out military conflict between the North and South into hyperdrive. The case revolved around a slave since birth by the name of Dred Scott. After the death of his original...
A slave since birth? Do you know how degrading that is? What? That sounds... I mean, that is obviously horrible. Just the idea of being a slave from birth, this is the way they were treated. Oh, mate, it boils my blood to the fact that this was even a conversation. Oh, mate. Fucking hell, man.
Owner in 1832, Scott had been purchased by a man named John Emerson, and upon his death, Scott and his family would then be transferred to the ownership of Emerson's wife, Irene.
Bro, they're just treated like animals. They're literally being treated like animals. Like, what the actual hell was the world at this point?
Previously, Scott and his family had been brought along for travels across multiple free states and territories, although at no point had they attempted to run or sue for their freedom. Instead, once Irene took ownership, Scott attempted to buy their freedom off her. Irene was obstinate and insisted on keeping her slaves around, which led Dred and his wife Harriet to, finally, go the route of a lawsuit. They each filed on the basis of 2 Missouri statutes, as they were currently living with Irene in St. Louis. One stated that any slave taken to a free state would thus be free and could not be returned to enslavement even if they left the free state, while the other allowed for anyone to file a suit for wrongful enslavement. The Scott couple was given logistical support from abolitionists, fellow churchgoers, and ironically, the family of their previous owner. This allowed them to actually take their case to court, which was first shot down in 1847.
You shut it down, you get the rules in your state back, what they're going to court for. What?
On a technicality, but was given the option of a retrial. The next trial would come in January of 1850, and this time, the Scotts actually won their freedom. Irene, however, quickly appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court. 2 years later, the court sided once more with Irene.
Oh, it's Missouri. Oh.
Thus re-enslaving the Scott family.
What the flipping hell?
Family. Unwilling to give up now, Scott filed a federal lawsuit with the United States Circuit Court for the District of Missouri the following year. Before the case could be decided upon again, Irene would transfer the Scotts over to her brother, John Sanford, hence the name of the new case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. In the spring of 1854, the federal court ruled in favor of Sanford, thus prompting Scott to appeal yet again, now to the United States Supreme Court.
Do you know how degrading this actually just sounds, man? Do you know how degrading it is? Like, just the fact that you're having to appeal for some freedom. Mate, and this is what, 168 years ago? It's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. Like,
this final trial would start on February 11th, 1856, with a growing list of abolitionist and even politician supporters in favor of the Scotts. Nevertheless, less than a month later, a decision was made, and once more, Dred Scott had lost. And not only this, but the judge most notably credited for the final ruling asserted that no African American even had the right to sue for anything in the federal court.
Oh my god. I hope you rot in the lowest of the lowest parts of hell, you gremlin. Oh mate, what is this man? This is not a man. What the oh, hearing that makes me cringe so bad. How can that even come out of someone's mouth?
Because they lacked the ability to be United States citizens. While the Scotts would already have their freedom by now thanks to Irene's new abolitionist husband and the help of their old owner's family, the case itself was the final straw for many abolitionists. John Brown had now gone down in history as one of America's most infamous abolitionists, and on October 16, 1859, he would prove exactly why. He warned an army watchman as he and a group of fellow abolitionists launched what would be an ambitious but ultimately failed raid on Harper's Ferry. After taking several hostages from the town and capturing the U.S. Armory and Arsenal, the raiders would be stalled by a local militia as General Robert E. Lee made his way into the town to wrap things up. Brown and his men had aimed to spark a local slave rebellion, but instead, many of the raiders were killed once Lee and his Marines arrived, with Brown himself being captured and later hanged for his acts of treason against the state of Virginia.
Wow.
John Brown had failed, and he had died. But his animosity for the South was shared by far too many for the tide to be turned by this point. With the election of anti-slavery Northerner Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to the presidency, enough was enough. Immediately after, the future emancipator was
Wait, Washington and Baltimore, what? Maryland and Delaware were slave states as well. So where the capital was, there was a slave state. What?
elected to office, the South Carolina General Assembly called for a convention to consider secession. Much to the pleasure of the locals, South Carolina thus voted unanimously to leave the United States of America. Days later, they issued a document justifying their decision to secede and making one dramatically important point in the process. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union. And it truly had. 10 more southern states would follow suit and join the newly founded Confederate States of America, led by their chosen president, Jefferson Davis. The Union president, Abraham Lincoln, refused to recognize the Confederacy as legitimate, insisting that he wished to take no one's slaves and simply wanted to keep the Union together. This meant nil to the Southerners, who were rapidly attempting to create a unified nation out of a handful of states who had all made a big fuss about state autonomy.
Just imagine, yeah, these states, I know it's not how it is and it's so hard to actually think this would have happened, but just imagine they did become a separate country. So this was a separate country and then the rest was the US, I guess, because I guess these 4 states could have decided, but maybe let's just say these ones for now became its own country and they kept all the rules that they kept in place. How long do you reckon it would have taken them to change the rules, or do you think they would have just kept them until, like, how do you reckon that would have happened? The rules and stuff, like, and like allowing certain things that obviously are horrible to think of now, but back then they were doing it without any care. Do you reckon they'd have kept it the same way, or it would have slowly progressed to the point where it is now, where it's still not 100% better, but it's so much better than it was in these times, and obviously no slaveries are now allowed and stuff like that? How do you reckon that would have happened? Just the idea of this becoming its own country and how different it would have been is something I'm so curious about. And let's just say that it became a separate country. Do you reckon the relations between the US at this point and then, I forgot what this one's called again, but this side as well, do you reckon they'd have had any friendly relations, or would it have been like the most hostile relationship possible?
And not just that,
right?
but
even nowadays kind of thing. Like, how would the relationship be now? I mean, obviously it's impossible to answer because you don't know.
Made a big fuss about state autonomy. And not just that, but the South was at a major disadvantage for the impending war. Precise numbers are debated, but it can be estimated that at the time of the mass secession and formation of the Confederacy, the Union boasted a population of roughly 22 million in comparison to the South's approximate 9 million. Of those numbers, the Union would eventually enlist around 2 million soldiers, whilst the Confederates would only tally about 900,000. Furthermore, the Northerners had something close to 20,000 miles worth of railroads, which was double what the Confederate states could claim, thus giving the Union a better advantage for moving troops and supplies in wartime. And while it's often argued that the Confederate generals, such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Patrick Cleburne gave the South a tactical military edge on their upstairs neighbors, the North was surely ahead in other ways, like the fact that they produced around 90% of goods in the former United States at the time. But still, the Union was losing its grip on the South, and only had limited holdings left in Confederate states, and it was about to lose another. Fort Sumter was the last Union stronghold in South Carolina, and strong is being generous. It was outmanned and undersupplied, to say the least, and with Southerners now cracking down on Union property within their borders, it was surrounded. The Confederates attempted to force the little remaining Union forces at the fort to surrender. The latter refused, and the Confederates opened fire. The Civil War had begun.
Oh, shit. Well, damn. That is part 1. Is there a part 2? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's going to be posted soon or something. This video is a month old, so I assume it will be posted soon. But yeah, this was a really crazy video. I learned a lot. I've done reactions to the American Civil War before, especially to Oversimplified, but this was a whole other level, man. And it went more in depth into these certain issues that went on at the time. Rarely do I go to the comments to applaud a video, but this was phenomenal, extremely engaging. The effects, the music, the tone of the narrator, and all the history well put together and flowed perfectly. Great video. Earn a subscriber. Please do part 2 if you haven't. I'm gonna check it if you do or not. Ah, mate, we need a part 2. Aussie here. I've been learning about the Civil War and found this very informative. Yeah, this is a wild reaction. But yeah, let me know your thoughts, and when part 2 comes out, I will react to it. And that's pretty much it. Until next time, like, subscribe, peace.